August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered unconditionally after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For 3 years, Japanese civilians had been taught through relentless propaganda that Americans were inhuman monsters, sadistic devils who would rape, torture, and murder every Japanese person they encountered. Women were told to hide or commit suicide rather than face American soldiers. Schools taught children that Americans ate Japanese babies. Newspapers published fabricated atrocity stories. The message was clear: death was preferable to capture. So when American occupation forces landed in Japan in late August 1945, Japanese civilians expected hell women hid in basements. Families prepared poison for mass suicide. Entire villages fled to the mountains. But then something unexpected happened. American soldiers arrived and behaved nothing like the propaganda predicted. They distributed food instead of stealing it. They treated civilians with basic respect instead of brutality. They gave chocolate to terrified children instead of harming them. Yoko Kawashima, a 23-year-old Japanese woman hiding in Tokyo, later wrote, "We'd never seen men like this. We were taught they were devils, but they acted human." If you want to know how propaganda collapses when it meets reality, subscribe now. This is the story of what happened when the demons turned out to be men. From 1941 to 1945, the Japanese government conducted one of history's most comprehensive propaganda campaigns to dehumanize the enemy. The goal: convince the civilian population that surrender or occupation by Americans would be worse than death. The propaganda took multiple forms. Government-controlled newspapers published fabricated stories of American atrocities in the Philippines, claiming soldiers raped women publicly, bayoneted children for sport, tortured prisoners for entertainment. None of these stories were verified, but they were repeated until they became accepted truth. School textbooks taught children that Americans were beasts in human form, who lacked honor, morality, or basic humanity. Teachers told students that Americans descended from criminals and subhumans, biologically inferior to Japanese people. Radio broadcasts featured testimonies from fabricated witnesses describing American brutality. Movies depicted American soldiers as savage, mindless killers. Posters showed grotesque caricatures. Americans drawn as demons, monsters, apes. The most insidious propaganda targeted women specifically. Government pamphlets distributed to households warned that American soldiers would rape every woman they encountered, young, old, married, unmarried. The message: protect your honor through suicide rather than face capture. This wasn't unique to Japan. All nations used propaganda during World War II. American propaganda depicted Japanese as subhuman monsters. British propaganda portrayed Germans as barbarians. Soviet propaganda called Germans fascist beasts. War requires dehumanizing the enemy. It's easier to kill someone you don't see as human. But Japan's situation was unique in one crucial way. By August 1945, Japanese civilians would actually encounter American soldiers on their home soil. Propaganda would meet reality. And one side would be proven catastrophically wrong. The propaganda's intensity increased as Japan's military situation deteriorated. After the fall of Saipan in 1944, civilian suicides increased. Families jumped from cliffs rather than be captured by demons. After Okinawa in 1945, where thousands of civilians committed suicide, the Japanese government knew invasion of the home islands would cause civilian mass death. So the propaganda escalated. Radio broadcasts urged civilians to fight to the death. Schools trained children to attack American soldiers with bamboo spears. Women practiced group suicide techniques. The message: death with honor beats capture by monsters. By August 1945, after atomic bombs forced surrender, Japanese civilians genuinely believed Americans would arrive and commit genocide. Entire families prepared poison. Women shaved their heads and dressed as men to avoid rape. Villages evacuated to mountains. They were terrified, and they were about to learn their government had lied to them for 4 years. August 15th, 1945, noon. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios across Japan. The first time most citizens had ever heard their emperor speak his message, delivered in formal court Japanese that many couldn't fully understand, announced Japan's unconditional surrender. For Japanese civilians, this wasn't relief. It was terror. Surrender meant occupation. Occupation meant Americans would arrive, and Americans, according to 4 years of propaganda, were monsters. Yoko Kawashima was 23 years old, living with her family in Tokyo. When the surrender announcement came, her mother immediately gathered the family and presented a bottle of poison. "When the Americans come," her mother said, "we drink this together. We die with dignity, rather than suffer what they'll do to us." Similar scenes played out across Japan. Families stockpiled poison, rat poison, industrial chemicals, whatever they could find. Some practiced hanging themselves. Others sharpened kitchen knives, planning to cut their own throats rather than face American soldiers. Women were particularly terrified. The propaganda had been explicit. American soldiers would rape every woman they encountered. Age didn't matter. Marital status didn't matter. Americans were described as having insatiable, animalistic desires and no moral restraint. Japanese women took desperate measures. Some shaved their heads, believing it would make them less attractive. Others dressed in men's clothing, hoping to pass as male. Many applied dirt and ash to their faces, trying to appear ugly or old. Some bound their breasts to hide their gender. Thousands of women fled to the countryside or mountains, hiding in caves and abandoned buildings. Others locked themselves in their homes, barricading doors and windows. In some communities, men organized defense groups, not to fight Americans militarily, which they knew was hopeless, but to protect women's honor by killing them before Americans arrived. Women gave their husbands and fathers permission to kill them if Americans came. This wasn't hysteria or irrationality. It was the logical response to 4 years of consistent government-backed propaganda. Japanese civilians had been systematically taught that Americans were inhuman. They had no reason to doubt it. Their government, their teachers, their newspapers, their radios had all said the same thing. On August 28, 1945, the first American occupation forces landed at Atsugi Airfield near Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur arrived on August 30th. Thousands of American soldiers began deploying across Japan. Japanese civilians waited in terror for the atrocities to begin. Women hid. Families clutched poison bottles. Parents held their children close, preparing for the worst. Then the Americans started distributing food. The first American soldiers Yoko Kawashima saw were a patrol walking through her Tokyo neighborhood on September 2nd, 1945. She watched from behind curtains, heart pounding, waiting for the violence to begin. The soldiers walked past houses, rifles slung over shoulders, talking casually. They didn't kick down doors, didn't drag women into the street, didn't set fires. They just walked, like normal men on patrol. One soldier noticed children hiding behind a fence, terrified, starving children who'd been taught Americans ate babies. The soldier reached into his pack, pulled out chocolate bars, and offered them to the children. The children ran. They'd been taught American food was poisoned. The soldier shrugged, placed the chocolate on the ground, and walked away. After the patrol passed, the children cautiously approached the chocolate, smelled it. One brave child tasted it. Then they devoured it, the first sugar many had tasted in months. This scene repeated across Japan. American soldiers encountered terrified civilians and responded not with violence, but with food distribution. Japan was starving. Years of blockade and strategic bombing had destroyed food production and distribution. People were eating grass, bark, whatever they could find. The U.S. military brought massive food supplies. They distributed rations to civilian populations, set up feeding stations, provided medical care. Not from altruism, MacArthur understood that starving, desperate populations create instability, but the effect was the same. The demons were feeding people instead of killing them. Japanese civilians were confused. This wasn't what they'd been told would happen. Where was the brutality? Where was the mass rape? Where were the atrocities? Yoko Kawashima's mother refused to believe it initially. "They're lulling us into complacency," she insisted. "The real horror will come later." She kept the poison bottle for weeks, but weeks passed, and the horror never came. American soldiers behaved like soldiers. Some were kind, some were indifferent, some were rude, but they weren't demons. They weren't monsters. They were young men, many of whom just wanted to go home. This created profound cognitive dissonance for Japanese civilians. 4 years of propaganda had taught them one thing. Reality showed them another. The gap was impossible to reconcile. Not all interactions were positive. There were crimes committed by occupation forces, theft, assault, and yes, sexual violence occurred. Military police records document cases. The occupation was still a military occupation, with inherent power imbalances and problems. But the systematic, universal atrocities the propaganda had promised never materialized. Most American soldiers followed orders, behaved professionally, and treated civilians as humans rather than enemies. For Japanese women like Yoko, this created a strange new reality. Fear gave way to confusion, confusion to cautious observation, observation to reluctant acceptance that perhaps their government had lied to them about everything. The American soldiers who landed in Japan in 1945 had their own propaganda-shaped expectations. They'd been taught Japanese were fanatical, suicidal fanatics who'd fight to the last man. They expected ambushes, booby traps, civilian attacks. Instead, they found exhausted, starving people who'd been terrorized by their own government's propaganda. Private Robert Miller, 22, from Ohio, later wrote in his memoir, "We were told the Japanese would never surrender, that civilians would attack us with bamboo spears, that we'd face resistance everywhere. Instead, we found people hiding in ruins, terrified of us. It took weeks to realize they thought we were the monsters." The cultural differences were profound. American soldiers were informal, loud, friendly. They addressed everyone casually, made jokes, showed emotions openly. Japanese culture valued formality, hierarchy, emotional restraint. To American soldiers, Japanese civilians seemed distant and mysterious. To Japanese civilians, Americans seemed childlike and undisciplined. But these differences humanized both sides. Japanese women observed American soldiers and saw young men who missed their families, who showed photographs of girlfriends and wives, who got homesick and wrote letters. Not demons, not monsters, just young men far from home. Yoko Kawashima got a job as a translator for occupation forces in October 1945. She'd studied English in school and needed work desperately. Working directly with American soldiers terrified her initially. Her mother begged her not to go, certain she'd be harmed. Instead, Yoko found herself translating mundane conversations, supply requisitions, housing arrangements, logistical coordination. The American officers she worked with treated her professionally. They asked about her family, showed interest in Japanese culture, behaved respectfully. "I expected violence," Yoko wrote in her diary. "Instead, I got office work and polite conversation. Lieutenant Harris asked if I liked jazz music. Captain Stevens showed me photographs of his daughters in California. They treated me like a person." It sounds absurd, but after 4 years of being told they were beasts, discovering they were human was shocking. Cultural exchanges happened spontaneously. American soldiers introduced Japanese civilians to jazz, baseball, chewing gum, Hollywood films. Japanese civilians taught Americans about tea ceremony, proper bowing etiquette, Japanese gardens, calligraphy. These weren't equal exchanges. Occupation inherently involves power imbalance. Americans held authority, resources, security. Japanese civilians were defeated, occupied, vulnerable. Some women entered relationships with American soldiers out of genuine affection. Others did so for survival, access to food, protection, economic security. The occupation created approximately 200,000 mixed-race children, evidence of relationships ranging from consensual to exploitative. Many of these children faced severe discrimination in Japanese society. But amid complexity, propaganda collapsed. Japanese civilians learned Americans weren't demons. American soldiers learned Japanese weren't fanatical subhumans. Both sides discovered shared humanity. They laughed at similar jokes, loved their families, wanted peace. The propaganda machines on both sides had dehumanized the enemy face-to-face interaction, rehumanized them. By late 1945, the initial terror had faded, replaced by cautious coexistence. Japanese civilians still remembered the propaganda, but daily reality contradicted it so consistently that belief eroded. Yoko Kawashima stopped carrying the poison bottle her mother had given her. At some point, she later wrote, I realized I'd been working alongside American soldiers for 3 months, and nothing terrible had happened. I'd translated thousands of conversations, attended dozens of meetings. If they were going to harm me, they'd had countless opportunities, but they just worked, like normal people. Her mother took longer to accept reality. Many older Japanese, who'd lived through decades of militarist propaganda, struggled to reconcile what they'd been taught with what they observed. Some never fully accepted it. They remained suspicious of Americans until death, convinced the kindness was temporary or strategic. But younger Japanese, especially those who worked directly with occupation forces, adapted faster. They saw Americans struggling with chopsticks, getting confused by Japanese customs, making honest mistakes trying to communicate. It was hard to maintain fear of people who were clearly just as confused and fallible as anyone else. General Douglas MacArthur's occupation policies focused on reconstruction rather than punishment. Unlike the harsh post-WWI treatment of Germany, which had fueled resentment and extremism, MacArthur aimed for transformation. He implemented land reform, giving farmland to tenant farmers, introduced democratic governance, granted women voting rights, helped rebuild infrastructure. The American military brought resources Japan desperately needed: food, medicine, construction materials, agricultural supplies. They employed thousands of Japanese civilians in occupation work: translators, drivers, office workers, construction laborers. These jobs provided income for families on the brink of starvation. Schools reopened with revised curricula, no more propaganda about American demons. Teachers, many of whom had taught the propaganda, now taught democracy and peace. The cognitive dissonance must have been profound. Japanese women observed American gender dynamics with fascination and confusion. American servicemen treated women with casual friendliness that seemed shockingly informal by Japanese standards. Women in the U.S. military, nurses, administrators, support staff, worked alongside men, gave orders, held authority. This was revolutionary for Japanese women accustomed to strict gender hierarchy. Some Japanese women embraced these new possibilities. Others found them unsettling, threatening traditional values. The occupation accelerated social changes that would transform Japanese society over the following decades. By 1946, relationships between American soldiers and Japanese women had become common enough that military authorities issued regulations governing them. Some servicemen married Japanese women and brought them to America. Approximately 50,000 Japanese war brides emigrated to the U.S. between 1945 and 1952. These relationships were controversial on both sides. Many Japanese families opposed their daughters marrying former enemies. American society harbored its own racism. Japanese war brides faced discrimination in the United States, especially in the immediate post-war years. But these relationships represented something profound: the complete collapse of propaganda-driven dehumanization. You can't maintain that someone is a demon when you're falling in love with them. You can't believe they're monsters when you're introducing them to your family. The propaganda had promised apocalypse. Reality delivered reconstruction, coexistence, and gradual trust. Yoko Kawashima continued working as a translator for American occupation forces until 1948. In 1950, she married a Japanese businessman and lived in Tokyo until her death in 2013 at age 91. In interviews during her later years, she reflected on those early months of occupation with a perspective shaped by 7 decades of distance. "I was taught my entire youth that Americans were devils," she said in a 2010 interview. "Every institution I trusted, my government, my teachers, my newspapers, told me the same lie consistently. I believed it completely. Why wouldn't I? Then the Americans arrived, and within weeks, the lie collapsed. Not because someone told me it was false, but because I saw with my own eyes that it was." She paused, then added, "That experience taught me to question everything I'm told about the enemy. Because if my government could lie that thoroughly about Americans, what else might governments lie about? What other enemies are actually just people?" The American occupation of Japan lasted until 1952. During those 7 years, Japan transformed from a militaristic empire to a democratic nation. American influence reshaped Japanese government, economy, education, and culture. But the most profound transformation was psychological. Japanese civilians who'd believed Americans were subhuman monsters learned they were wrong. American soldiers who'd believed Japanese were fanatical subhumans learned the same lesson. The mechanism of that learning was simple. Human contact propaganda works at a distance. It thrives on abstraction, stereotype, and lack of actual interaction with the enemy. But propaganda struggles to survive face-to-face contact because humans instinctively recognize shared humanity in others when given the chance. This doesn't mean the occupation was without problems. It was still a military occupation with inherent power imbalances. Sexual violence occurred. Military records document thousands of reported cases, and many more likely went unreported. Economic exploitation happened. Cultural insensitivity was common. Some American soldiers abused their authority, and Japanese society faced its own reckoning. Women who'd had relationships with American soldiers faced severe social stigma, called pan girls, prostitutes. Many were ostracized by their communities. Mixed-race children born to Japanese mothers and American fathers experienced brutal discrimination. Many were given up for adoption or raised in orphanages because Japanese society rejected them. The occupation wasn't a fairy tale of instant friendship between former enemies. It was messy, complex, often painful, but it proved one crucial thing. Systematic dehumanization through propaganda can be reversed through human interaction, not perfectly, not completely, but significantly enough to change the trajectory of history. By the 1950s, Japan and the United States had become allies. The nation that had dropped atomic bombs on Japanese cities was now providing economic aid, military protection, and technological assistance. The transformation was unprecedented, from total war to close alliance in less than a decade. That transformation was only possible because propaganda's dehumanization had been systematically dismantled. American policymakers could justify massive aid to Japan because they no longer saw Japanese as subhuman enemies. Japanese citizens could accept alliance with America because they no longer believed Americans were demons. The mechanism was direct contact. American soldiers and Japanese civilians interacting daily, working together, solving problems together, gradually recognizing shared humanity. Modern historians debate MacArthur's occupation policies. Some praise his democratic reforms, others criticize his authoritarian approach. But there's consensus on one point. The occupation succeeded partly because it forced former enemies to see each other as human. The lessons extend beyond 1945 Japan. Every war involves propaganda dehumanizing the enemy. It's psychologically necessary to make soldiers willing to kill. But that dehumanization creates long-term problems. Cycles of revenge, inability to negotiate peace, failure to reconcile after conflict ends. Japan and America provide a counterexample. Despite horrific warfare, Pearl Harbor, Bataan Death March, firebombing of Tokyo, atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the two nations moved from total war to alliance in less than a decade. How? By forcing human contact that propaganda couldn't survive. Yoko Kawashima's experience was repeated millions of times across Japan. Individual Japanese civilians encountering individual American soldiers and discovering propaganda had lied. Each interaction was small, sharing chocolate, translating documents, asking for directions. But collectively, these small interactions dismantled 4 years of systematic dehumanization. This doesn't mean all wars can be resolved through friendship. Power dynamics, historical grievances, resource conflicts, and ideological differences create real obstacles to peace. But the Japanese-American experience proves that even after total war, reconciliation is possible if former enemies are willing to see each other as human. In 2015, 70 years after the war's end, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Pearl Harbor. In 2016, President Barack Obama visited Hiroshima. Both visits emphasized reconciliation, shared humanity, and commitment to peace. These visits were possible because of the work done in 1945 to 1952. The difficult, messy, imperfect work of dismantling propaganda through human contact. Yoko Kawashima attended the Hiroshima Memorial Ceremony in 2016. At 94 years old, she reflected on the 71 years since she'd hidden in her Tokyo home, clutching poison, waiting for American demons to arrive. "I was lucky," she said. "I lived long enough to see my government's lies proven false. I lived long enough to see former enemies become allies. I lived long enough to understand that propaganda works by preventing human contact, because once you meet the enemy face to face, you realize they're not demons, they're just people." She continued, "That's the lesson I hope younger generations remember. When your government tells you the enemy is inhuman, subhuman, monstrous, question it. Because throughout history, that's what governments tell their people to make war acceptable. And throughout history, that lie collapses the moment people actually meet each other. Today, Japan and the United States maintain one of the world's strongest alliances. Japanese cities where atomic bombs fell are thriving metropolises. American military bases remain on Japanese soil, now welcomed rather than feared. This transformation wasn't inevitable. It required deliberate choices. By MacArthur to pursue reconstruction rather than revenge, by Japanese civilians to overcome propaganda-induced fear, by soldiers on both sides to recognize shared humanity despite recent warfare. But the foundation was human contact. Americans and Japanese working together, living alongside each other, discovering that propaganda's monsters were actually people. Flawed, complex, but fundamentally human. Here's the truth about propaganda. It requires distance to survive. It thrives when enemies never meet, never speak, never recognize each other's humanity. But it collapses when forced to confront reality, when the demons turn out to be young men who miss their families, when the subhumans turn out to be people who love their children, when the monsters turn out to be humans who laugh, cry, and bleed like everyone else. In August 1945, Japanese women hid from American soldiers, believing propaganda's promise of apocalypse. By 1946, some were working alongside them, marrying them, building lives with them. The propaganda couldn't survive human contact. Dehumanization couldn't survive daily interaction. Fear couldn't survive the gradual recognition of shared humanity. If this story made you think differently about propaganda and dehumanization, consider subscribing. Share this so others remember that every war involves lies about the enemy, and that truth emerges when propaganda meets reality. Comment about how human contact changes perspectives, because that lesson matters more today than ever. They were taught Americans were devils. Americans were taught Japanese were fanatics. Both sides were lied to, and both sides discovered the truth the same way, by actually meeting each other. Propaganda works at a distance. Humanity works up close. Remember that the next time you're told the enemy isn't human. Because in 1945, millions of Japanese and Americans learned that lesson, and it changed history.